to let you kind of know, I'm Beth Hamaty. I'm with the Big Country Master Gardeners. So when they first asked me, when I started talking about or thinking about doing your garden in fall and winter, I really just kind of focused on the things that I'm concerned with and things that I try to get done in the fall and the winter. Being in Texas is a little bit different than being up north. I've always lived in Texas. But I have friends who live up north, and I know kind of some of the stuff that they have to deal with. I have a friend in Colorado. It's very different gardening for him than it is for me. He pretty much shuts down about mid-October because there's not a whole lot he can do once things start cooling off a little bit. But we're lucky because most of the time we don't have a lot of really, really cold weather. Now, it is Texas, and Mother Nature likes to, play with us here a little bit. But most of the time, our winters are fairly mild, more or less. Okay, except for 1 week. Usually there's 1 week when it's miserable cold and ice, and but other than that, it's not too bad. So we'll go ahead and get started. I think this is probably about everybody's going to be here. So, so the first thing that I do in fall and winter is plant. And this is something as Master Gardeners we're constantly trying to convince people, plant in the fall and the winter. It's really the best time to do that in our area, especially for hardy perennials, shrubs, and trees. I walk around a lot, so if I get in the way, I apologize. Our ground temperatures don't normally get below 45 degrees, and if they do, it's for a short period of time. As long as it's above 45, roots are growing. Okay? Nothing much is going on above ground, but below ground a lot's going on. Think about it, it's kind of like a duck, okay? On the surface, everything's placid, smooth, and underneath those little feet are just going, all right? That's the way plants are around here, all right? Because we get heat sometimes very early in the spring, this year being a great example of that, it helps to get those roots kind of established before summer heat comes along. Now, we're generally talking about plants that are rated for our hardiness zone or colder. You definitely don't want to be planting tropicals this time of year or anything that's very tender. You definitely want it to be things that are rated at least for 7, if not colder. So, speaking of planting, I do some of my best vegetable gardening in the wintertime. I am not a big vegetable person because I don't eat a lot of vegetables, but I like greens. I like green salads and things like that. And I have found that they do really well in the wintertime. I don't have to pester with them much. I can grow spinach and lettuce and things along those lines. And they do pretty well in our winter weather. Spinach, lettuce, kale, broccoli, carrots, beets, all like the cool weather. I will say that my one attempt at growing broccoli, I spent more on the broccoli plant than I'd got off the broccoli plant. I got like 1 head of broccoli. It was a little disappointing. I may try it again at some point, but it didn't go quite the way I wanted. But spinach and lettuce I get lots of. So for really cold nights, row covers will work. In my house, row covers usually consist of old towels or old sheets because I don't spend a lot of money on fancy equipment and stuff, but you can get row covers online pretty easily and they're not terribly expensive, especially if you've got a big area. My vegetable gardening tends to be container gardening for the most part. So it's a little bit different if you've got a big garden. I've done salad gardens in large pots that I use for flowers in the summertime. I put a tomato cage in there, and then when it gets cold, I throw a towel over the tomato cage. My sister-in-law does a bowl. She has a plastic, it looks like clay, pot that's kind of shallow. She puts all of her little veggies in there that she wants for her salad, all of her greens, and then she puts it in a sunny spot in her front yard. And if they get a cold snap down in Austin, she picks it up and brings it in the house. And then when it's pretty again, she sticks it back out. And she ends up with greens all winter long. The best part of this is fewer bugs. I'm not going to say no bugs, because I've actually had mealy bugs in the wintertime. That's annoying. But for the most part, you don't have to deal with a lot of pests. You also don't have to water quite as much because the temperatures are cooler and we don't have the evaporation rates. Not that we get a lot more rain, just that it doesn't evaporate as much. So this is also the best time to plant Texas wildflowers. All right. Fall and winter is wildflower planting season. I'm working on a project over at the Wasp Museum in Sweetwater. If you haven't been, you should go. It's great. But we're working on a project, and I was talking with George Cates down at Native American Seed. And they are one of the big providers of native Texas wildflower seeds in the state. And he was saying, I was asking him, I said, how long, because we're still in the process of kind of prepping beds. We got a grant a little late, and so we're getting a bit of a late start. And I said, how late should I worry about getting these seeds in the ground? He said, I wouldn't worry about them. Anytime before spring, you get them in there, they get the right amount of soil, they're going to water, they're going to germinate. If they don't get the right amount of water, they won't germinate, but they might germinate next year. So he says, they usually wait for when the conditions are right for them. And he said, so don't feel like you have to get them in before the first frost. You can throw those seeds out after the first frost, not a problem. So they're going to come up and form small plants. They may look like weeds, so if you put out wildflower seeds, be careful. They may not be weeds. They won't seem to do much. They'll just kind of stay there on the ground, usually pretty small. And then once things start warming up, you'll start seeing them grow. Other seeds to sow at this time of year are larkspurs and poppies. Anything that self-sows, you can go ahead and throw those out there. And larkspurs, last year I didn't get a lot of larkspurs. I think it was a combination of several different things. So I got some more seeds this year, and I've already thrown them out in the garden. I'm waiting a little bit more on the poppies. My mom says throw poppy seeds out on the snow. She's from Texas. We don't get that much snow. I don't know where she came up with that. But I'll wait till probably January to throw those out when it's considerably colder. But a lot of these seeds actually, one, need some frost and the freeze and warming to crack the shell on them, the seed coat. And then some just like to get a head start and kind of get established, and they'll sit there kind of snuggled in amongst the fallen leaves and stuff and wait for things to warm up. Okay, moving and dividing. This is another good time to move and divide. Now we're probably going to have a frost this weekend. I don't know about a hard freeze. Hard freeze is 28 degrees for at least an hour. We probably won't get that cold. We'll probably hit right at 32 for an hour, maybe two. So if you have some things you want to divide, I wouldn't do it right this second. I'd probably wait. In a couple of weeks, we're supposed to get some more kind of mild fall-like weather. And if you're going to divide stuff, I'd wait till then. If they have frozen back, that's okay. They've gone dormant. So if you've got some different ground covers or bulbs or whatever that you're wanting to transplant, that'd be a good time. So fairly mild winters is going to give you an opportunity to divide and transplant plants in your garden. Divide spring and summer blooming plants now to get a head start for the summer. Fall blooming plants should be divided and transplanted in the spring. So whenever they bloom, you're going to want to divide or transplant the opposite season. Now, what if you got something that blooms in the spring and the fall? I'd pick which one they bloom the least. So I've got some salvias that I'll probably transplant after they've died back from our first freeze. They do both spring and fall, but fall's when they're really prettiest. Okay, so move tender plants indoors. That's what I did this morning. I started the great migration of plants into the greenhouse. I didn't get everything in, but I got quite a few things. Some things I will probably just throw a towel over this weekend. I don't know about y'all. I've had tons of butterflies, so I hate to let everything freeze back, because usually what will happen is we'll see a few more after it warms up again, and I want something for them to be able to nectar on. So things that are in the ground, if we have a freeze, they'll die back, but if I got a few things in flower pots, they'll be good. Most of the time, the stuff that I overwinter tends to be succulents and some tropicals and things like that. So now's a good time to start taking those things in. You want to clean the outside of the pots, especially under the edges. You don't want any surprises. I moved some pots earlier in the summer and found a lovely black widow underneath one of them. So that's kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies a little bit. So I made sure to put on my gloves this morning when I was moving pots. But didn't find any surprises, so that was good. You do want to check for pests, aphids, mealybugs, spider mites, any of those little things that could be in your plants. You can drench or dunk plants into soapy water. I have a friend, and I can't remember who it is. It's somebody at Master Gardeners who just takes a big tub, makes up soapy water, and takes the whole pot and plant and everything, just kind of dunks it in, swishes it around, pulls it out, and then rinses it off after a little while. And that soapy water gets into the top of the soil, it gets in all the little cracks and crevices in the plants, and helps get rid of those bugs. If you have ants, have you ever had ants in a flower pot? I get them all the time. The quickest way I have figured out to get rid of ants in a flower pot is use borax. You can buy borax in the laundry aisle. It's used for cleaning clothes, whitening, brightening, and that kind of stuff. And so you take some borax and equal or slightly large amount of powdered sugar, mix it together real good, put a little bit of water in it, just enough to make a paste, and then I set it in the lid of a pickle jar, you know, the lid for my pickle jars, or something else that's shallow, and then I put it either beside the pot or in the top of the pot. And what's going to happen is those ants are going to smell the sugar, they're going to go, yippee, and they're going to go in there and they're going to get it, and they're going to take it back, but the borax is going to kill them. And so that usually will get rid of them, the whole thing. It won't just run off the ants that are coming in contact with it. They'll actually take it back and feed it to the rest of the nest. So that usually within about 3 days, they'll be gone. So that works pretty well, and it's fairly safe to use. It's not a real strong chemical. Okay, so another big thing that we do in the wintertime is pruning. Pruning is a nerve-wracking kind of thing. There's a lot of things I get really nervous about pruning. Oak trees is one of them. I finally just bit the bullet and had an arborist come in and do it. Well, he's not technically an arborist, but he's a tree guy who I trust. And he pruned mine last year and did a really great job. But there's lots of things that I can prune. And it's just trying to figure out what I need to prune, not over pruning, not under pruning. So I found this graphic I think is really nice. I'm going to switch real quick to my pointer. And it shows the kind of things that you need to be looking for when you're pruning. I'm going to kind of scoot over here so I'm out of the way, and y'all can kind of see what's what. So number one is crossing branches. If you have any branches that are crossing, especially if they're touching or they're going to be touching before too long, you're going to want to remove at least one of those. I see this on crepe myrtles a lot. The branches tend to grow pretty close together, so that can be an issue. Sometimes with pecan trees, that's usually the two where I see them the most, at least in my yard. But if you've got something rubbing, you definitely want to remove it, because as they rub, they're going to open up the bark, and that's going to be a vector for infection or for bugs or any kind of thing along those lines. So water spouts, I'd never heard this term, but I recognized it. It's that odd branch that's just shooting straight up out of the middle of your tree or out of your shrub, and it's kind of odd looking. I get them on my yopon a lot, but it needs to be taken out. Again, it's probably going to rub on something. It's not growing naturally. It looks kind of out of place. Hanging branches, anything that's growing down is probably going to need to come out at some point or another. Closely spaced branches, let's see, that's number 4. Okay, here you've got them, they're real close together. Want to open that up a little bit, get some sunshine in there. Of course, broken limbs. And broken limbs can be done any time of the year. You don't have to wait till winter to do them. Branch stubs. Someone didn't know how to prune this properly, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second, but you want to get rid of that. And then, of course, suckers. Again, yopons, crepe myrtles, lots of different trees and shrubs will put out those suckers at the bottom. Okay, so let me click on my narrative here. I got ahead of myself sometimes. Okay, so shrubs and trees that need to be pruned should be done after the first frost. Okay, so we're going to have one here pretty quick, and so it'll be time to do that. I usually wait till we've had a couple of good hard freezes. I tend to wait till January and February for a couple of reasons. Usually by that point, I'm itching to do something in the yard because I've been in the house a lot, and it's usually a really good cold day, and that's really a good time to do your pruning. By the way, if you are pruning oaks, now is the time to do it. Is when it starts getting really cold, because oak wilt is an issue in our community, and it tends to the insects are less active in the wintertime, and they're what spread the oak wilt disease. But remember, if you are pruning oaks, you're going to need to paint that cut. Just use any kind of latex paint. You don't have to get anything fancy. I had some brown house trim paint, and that's what I used when I did my oak, and cover that up. Because even if we don't have it's a cold day and we don't have a lot of activity, before that completely heals up, we could have 2-3 weeks of warm weather and suddenly the bugs are moving around. And they can come from a long way. They can smell that open wound on an oak miles away. Okay, so roses. Wait to prune your roses around Valentine's Day. Don't prune plants that bloom on old wood. Okay, so honeysuckle, for example, blooms on old wood. Texas mountain laurel blooms on old. Matter of fact, Texas mountain laurel's probably already set the blooms for the spring. They just don't look like blooms yet. If you don't know whether your plant blooms on old or new wood, Google it or use whatever search engine you prefer. It's amazing how much information is out there, especially if you're going with a specific plant, and it'll tell you. Okay, so the nitty-gritty of pruning, okay? So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. If you can prune that branch with a pair of lops, you're probably in pretty good shape. If you're going to need, it's big enough, you're going to need a saw, you probably need another set of hands, okay? The one thing you do not want is a large branch falling on your head. So I learned that the hard way, okay? Luckily, it was not super big, but it was a little bit bigger than I should have been taken on by myself. So try to have an extra pair of hands to help you with those larger branches, okay? So the big deal is, where do I cut that branch? And this is kind of hard. It takes a little bit of practice and kind of learning where you need to make the cut. But this graphic shows you some good examples of the rights and the wrongs. So up here we have a branch that was cut off right at the main trunk. And what's happened is, by doing that, you've got a really big area that's exposed, and it'll take longer for it to heal. It won't kill the plant if you cut it off flush, but it's going to take a long time for the bark to grow back over and heal up that cut. This one is what I call a stub cut, all right? They've gone out way too far. And as a result, what will happen is the bark will never grow all the way out and cover that up. It'll die. The bark will die right here, and you'll end up with this little stub that ends up dead wood and becomes a vector for problems. Insects, disease, that kind of thing. So what you want to do is you want to find the collar. And that's kind of where this branch starts to kind of spread out from that main trunk, where it starts to widen just a little bit. After you start looking at branches and doing some trimming, you get to where you can kind of see where that is. And so you want it to be a small enough cut that the bark can come over the top of it, all right? But close enough that the bark can do that it's not so sticking out so far that the bark can't get out around it and cover it up. That's not a very good explanation, but y'all understand what I'm saying? Okay, that's what counts. All right, so, that's what happens when I have to switch back and forth. Okay, so here's a couple of things to keep in mind. If you do have a big branch that has a lot of weight on it, you don't want to just cut it. You need to make multiple cuts, all right? So the first thing you're going to do on this big branch is you're going to cut a notch on the bottom of the branch. Because the problem you have is when you start cutting that big branch and it gets closer and closer and closer to being cut through, the branch is going to start sagging and it's going to want to rip the bark. And you don't want that to happen. So with this little cut here, that's going to keep that from happening. Okay? So that's your first cut, is A. Your second cut is going to be along this line, AB. What you're doing here is you're taking most of the weight off of the branch. All right? And then you're going to go back and you're going to tidy it up with your CD cut, where you're leaving that collar, and you only have to worry about this part. And again, it's going to keep that from ripping the bark on the branch, and it's going to work out much better for you. Okay? Now, what does a good cut look like? Like that. You can kind of see the collar there, how it's kind of starting to kind of widen there a little bit for the branch. The bark will be able to come in and cover that up. It may take a little while, but eventually it will heal that over. Okay. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Like I said, I don't think I explained it very well, but I hope the pictures helped. Yes, sir?
How about painting the wounds?
Generally speaking, my understanding is that you don't need to really paint the wounds on most trees. Oaks are the only ones we're really worried about. Most of the time, the trees can heal on their own, and it's not an issue. The oaks, it's all about the oak wilt and trying to keep that from spreading. So if you do feel like you have to do it, latex paint is the best thing to do. All right, so don't commit crepe myrtle, okay? I don't know if y'all know what crepe myrtle is, but that's when you top out crepe myrtles. I don't know who came up with this idea. I think that there's a special place and a very bad place for them because it ruins these trees. It does. It just destroys them in a lot of different ways. And I know perfectly competent lawn people who will come in and just whack those things off. And then you spend all this time trying to kind of fix the problem. I had an arborist one time tell a group that was living or was listening to him, he said basically the only way you can fix a crepe myrtle that's been topped out is to cut it off at the bottom, cut it flush with the ground, let new suckers come up, pick out 2 or 3 of those that you want to be your main trunks and cut the rest of them down. He said they'll recover pretty quickly because they've got a nice root system underneath it, but there's really no other way to fix the problem. But what happens when you top these things out, one, you're going to destroy the natural beauty of the tree. Okay? Second, you're going to weaken its immune responses because here's what's going to happen. You got this branch and you whack it off. Okay? And it's going to go, oh my heavens, I've got to replace all those leaves that was on that branch. And so it's going to send up a whole bunch of little branches like this. They're not very sturdy. They're going to end up being kind of brittle. There's going to be too many branches close together. And one of the things we have to deal with crepe myrtles is powdery mildew. And when you've got a whole bunch of branches really close together, they tend to hold that moisture in. And so you end up with a really big mess. And if some of those things start breaking off, then you have vectors for insects and disease and things along those lines to come in. And the tree is so busy trying to put out new branches and new foliage to recover that it can't fight off any diseases or attacks from insects that are going to come in. Top crepe myrtles have a weak branch connections and they're prone to breaking. In the long run, the process actually causes the trees to produce fewer flowers. The idea is that if you cut them off because they bloom on new wood, you're creating a bunch of new wood and you'll get a whole bunch of new blooms. But the problem is it's so busy trying to put out new branches and leaves, it's not going to flower much. So you're defeating the purpose. The main thing with crepe myrtles when you get ready to put one in is, one, check how tall it's going to be. Because we have a tendency to think that crepe myrtles are small trees, and some of them are. And some of them are not. Some of them get really big. So you need to put the right size plant in the right place. Basically look at how big it's going to get. You just don't want to get something that's going to be really tall that end up under the edge of your house or under the electric drops and things along those lines. You just want to make sure it fits the spot. And as always, keep in mind how big it's going to get when you start thinking about how close you're going to put it to things like your house. I had to cut one of mine down because I planted it too close to my house. But it was one of the first things I ever planted. So.
Now, does one color do better than another in this area?
My understanding is that the ones that do really well are named after Indian tribes. Natchez, Tuscarora, Lipan. There's a couple of different websites that you can go to that'll give you a lot of information about crepe myrtles. Neil Sperry is a Texas gardener. He writes a lot of books. I think his website has some good information on crepe myrtles. McKinney, Texas is considered the crepe myrtle capital of Texas. They have lots and lots and lots of them planted. and you might check on their city website. I think they have some stuff. But just Google it. I know I was trying to find some specific sizes for a friend, and I found, and I should have written it down, but it was a website, and it basically listed based on size. These are the biggest ones. These are going to be your kind of medium size. This is going to be a small tree. This is going to be shrubs and the real small, little, tiny, micro ones. So there's good information out there on the internet. Okay, so cutting back perennials and ornamental grasses. Don't. That's the best thing I can tell you right now. That's good news. You do not need to get out in the fall and cut everything back after the first freeze. Just leave it for a little while, okay? There's a reason for that. Wait till late winter, early spring to do all that cutting back. For one thing, you'll be ready to get out in the yard by that point. But these perennials, those stems, the leaves, the grasses, they all provide shelter for beneficial insects, and seed heads are going to provide food for birds. All right? A lot of our beneficials overwinter in leaf litter and in grasses and things along those lines. So you're providing habitat for them. All right. If you just can't stand the look, and I know I get that way sometimes, cut it back by about half. Okay? The other thing is when you leave those stems coming up out of the ground, you'll find that leaves get caught in there and you think, oh, I'm going to have to clean all those leaves out. No, don't worry about it. Leave the leaves. Because what's going to happen is that's going to insulate the crown of the plant and help to protect it from temperature changes. Plus, doesn't that look pretty with all the frost on the grasses? I think it looks nice. Okay. Exception, cut back woody salvias by 2/3. So if you have a salvia greggii, y'all know salvia greggii on up sage? If it's starting to get big and kind of leggy looking, it's time to prune it back. And prune it back by about 2/3 once we have our first big freeze and it's gone dormant, and then it'll come back out in the springtime and look much nicer. If you've only had that greggii for a year or two, it may not need to be pruned. What you're looking for is you're looking for the base of that to start looking like wood instead of soft plant material. It's okay to have some wood on there, but when it starts to get really leggy and too tall and thin, then it's time to give it a good cut back. And you'll be surprised. Last winter, I had someone drive through my front yard. Took out a rose bush and a bunch of salvias, and I thought, oh my gosh, those poor salvias. They had just gotten over the big winter, okay? The blizzard of 21, all right? And I thought, now, I had to cut them back to the ground after that big freeze. Now they're gone. You know what? Every single one of them came back. And some of them were not that old. Some of them were about 3 years old. I had one that it's probably like 5 years old. But they all came back. They came back from the roots because the roots were strong. Okay, so speaking of leaves. Oh, yes, ma'am.
What about lantanas?
Lantanas, I usually wait till spring to cut those back. I mean, if they're looking really bad, you can cut them back a little bit, but be sure to wear long sleeves and gloves.
And what about the Russian sage?
Russian sage, I do the same thing. I do it in the early spring, late winter. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I usually wait till late winter to trim those back too. Yeah, but yeah, most of my perennials I do some decent trimming on because a lot of those are going to come back from new. Yes, sir.
So when we have a big freeze coming, we tend to go out there and cover all those bushes with tarps.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these bushes get really tall
Mm-hmm.
in the summertime.
Yeah.
So we end up now with huge amount of sheets.
Yeah.
And so if we wait until spring,
Uh-huh.
we'll be dealing with all these parts and things.
Well, if they are hardy in zone 7, you shouldn't have to cover them up. So salvias you won't have to cover up, Russian sage you won't have to cover up. Some lantanas are hardy. It depends on which ones you're talking about. You got to look them up. I know the native lantana, which is the orange, and it's Lantana horrida. It's pretty hardy. You can't hardly kill it.
Got to be careful handling it too.
Yeah, because they have fuzzy stems, and then when it freezes, that all gets brittle. And that's why I said wear long sleeves and gloves when you're handling lantanas, because you'll get that stuff. It's like just tiny little splinters all in your hands. And again, voice of experience here, just do that. But some lantanas will freeze back, so I just look them up and see which ones. Now, I have a Dallas Red that's in my front yard, and it's a zone 8, but it made it through the winter of 21, but it's on the south side of my house. So it's kind of sheltered. It got cold, but it survived and did fine. So with lantanas, you never know. Sometimes they come back and surprise you, and sometimes they make you sad. And I've got some in pots. I'm probably going to bring them in. But the ones that I have in the ground, I've got trailing purple. I've got the Dallas Red. I've got the one my mom used to call ham and eggs because it's pink and yellow. And it's done fine. So the ones I have in the ground, I haven't had any issues with. They've come back. And I don't cover them up, other than throwing a little mulch on them. Okay, so speaking of leaves, leave the leaves. I've been reading article after article after article on leaving the leaves. This goes along with not cutting back your perennials. Leave them in your beds. They're going to act as mulch. They're going to become compost. They're habitat for butterflies. Lots and lots of butterflies overwinter in the leaves. Some will overwinter in cocoons. Some will overwinter as butterflies themselves. You know how on a warm day you go out in January and it's nice outside and you see these little yellow butterflies? They've been sleeping in your leaves. Just snuggle down there. Fireflies, their larvae sleep in the leaves. So amphibians, lizards, salamanders, all those kinds of things, box turtles, they take shelter in those leaves, and that's where they're going to live. And of course, all those insects become a snack bar for the birds because most birds are insectivores. And so you want to leave that. Now, when I was growing up, they kept telling me, you want to get rid of all those leaves because they can harbor disease. I think they harbor disease if the disease is already there. I don't think it's like disease is coming out of the leaves from nowhere. I think if you have a sick plant, yes, you're probably going to want to clean up around them and mulch them and that kind of stuff. But I think if you have a perfectly healthy plant and you've got leaves underneath it, I don't think it's an issue. Now, oak leaves take a long time to break down, and if you have a live oak, you know that those live oak leaves, they live forever. I mean, they're on the ground and they just don't disappear. So I think with oaks, it's a little bit different situation. But with most trees, pecans and elms and things like that, those leaves break down relatively quickly. If the leaves are on your lawn and you're concerned that they're really, really deep, you can run over them with a mulching mower. That'll hit, and then you just leave them. I mean, you run them over with that mulching mower and break those things down, and then over the winter, they'll break down further, put nutrients back into your soil. Or you can rake them into a pile and put them somewhere out of the way where, again, they can foster insects and things along those lines. In our part of Texas, most of them are going to blow away anyway. I have a friend, and that's what she always says. No one in West Texas should ever rake their leaves. They're going to blow away anyway. And she's not wrong, because they usually do. One year I thought, I'm going to save all these leaves, and I'm going to do a compost pile. I didn't have anything to save. They just blew away. My husband brought some he found in the alley in a sack, and I put them in my compost pile. So, yeah, if you have to get rid of leaves, you can always give them to a gardening friend who wants them for their compost pile. All right, so hardscaping. I don't like working in the heat. I'd much rather find a sunny day when it's in the 40s or 50s and go out and, work on my edging and things along those lines. And then I read an article and it's like, I was doing it right all along. Who knew? I thought I was just being lazy. So winter's a great time for building patios, fire pits, walkways. I do a lot of edging. I edge with bricks. And after, a couple of summers of being banged into by the mower, they're kind of cattywampus, so I'll have to go out every once in a while. I do that in the wintertime. It's one of the things I save for my winter, so I can get out in the yard and do some things. Pick a day that's sunny with a little wind, and you'll be surprised. When you're working hard, you'll warm up pretty quick. It's so much better than really hot weather. I also read this recently. If you're planning on hiring hardscaping done, lots of times it's cheaper in the winter, because they're looking for work. And sometimes materials will be cheaper, again, because they're looking to get rid of some of those things. So this is a good time to do that. New hardscaping will be ready to go, so when your temperatures warm up, boom, you can get outside and enjoy them. This is also a good time to dig new beds and expand existing ones. Again, digging in the cooler weather is much nicer than digging in the heat of summer. So, lay on the mulch. Now's the time to do it. Now's the time when you want to put that mulch down so you can protect your plants. It's going to insulate them, add nutrients to soil, hold moisture. We have pretty dry winters here in our part of the country, and it's going to help keep weed seeds from getting a foothold. It's not going to keep the weed seeds from popping up. It's just going to cut them down a little bit because in our part of the country, there's so many weed seeds blowing around, you're going to end up with weeds anyway. But the mulch is going to help mediate that just a little bit. Plants that are borderline in our zone should get an extra layer. So if you've got something that's zone 8 and it's in a good spot, but you're still worried about it a little bit, throw on some extra mulch, especially after that first little freeze that kills everything back. Now's a good time to see about maintaining your equipment. Gather up your stakes, your tomato cages, make notes of things that need to be repaired or need to be replaced. Lots of times some of these things are on sale this time of year, because people are going to get rid of what they had so that they can open up spots for new stuff in the spring. Mowers, edgers, etc. should be cleaned and put away for spring. I don't handle the mowers, edgers, etc. Anything that is powered, my husband does. That's his job. And I don't think he does much. I think he puts them in the shop, and that's about all that happens. But I understand you're supposed to, take the fuel out of them and things along those lines. I don't think he ever does that. Okay, hand tools that aren't going to be used should be cleaned, sharpened, oiled, and stored. And I actually do that most of the time. I have a couple of things I keep out, but most of mine do get put up, and I'm big on sharpening. We had a thing, one of the master gardeners a few years ago did a whole thing on sharpening your tools. If you've never sharpened your shovel, do it. You will be happy. It's so much easier to dig with. Clean unused pots now so they're ready to go in the spring. So they're, right there. Cleaning pots usually use, I think it's a 10-to-1 solution of bleach, 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. That should kill any bacteria, any viruses, anything along those lines. You can do that with plastic. You can do that with ceramic, clay, that kind of stuff. Okay, this is my favorite part of winter gardening. On those days when it's just too cold and wet, get you some hot chocolate, get you a nice latte, sit back and do some planning, read some books, find some good websites. There's a lot of them out there, and think about what you're going to be doing in the spring. If you're going to be extending some flower beds, if you want to add some plants, research some plants a little bit. Find out if there's something out there that sounds interesting that you think would work in your yard. You want to look at the newer garden tools, all right? See what's out there, gadgets. Sometimes they actually work. I have a favorite tool. It's called a hori-hori knife. It's a Japanese gardening knife. And I asked for one for Christmas a few years ago, and there was a little bit of mix-up between my husband and one of my sons, and I ended up with 2 of them. And my son was like, "I'm so sorry, Mom, you ended up with 2. I'm like, no, one for the front yard, one for the backyard. I won't have to go back and forth. This is perfect. And I love them because they're really great for cutting through roots and especially if you've got something that's really pot-bound, and you can't get those roots, just cut through them. It's good for cutting through if you're dividing stuff. If I've got a hole that's really tough clay and needs to, sometimes a big knife, helps. But they're great. So look and see what are some new gadgets that are out there. That's actually an old tool, but it was new to me because I'd never heard about it. Sorry. I go back. Yeah, because you need to make your Christmas list. Okay? So Santa will know what to bring you.